She was sitting in the armchair. She was seriously wheezing. Because when she was talking, like she was catching her breath big time.
Newry is a city in Northern Ireland that sits on the banks of the Clanrye River, nestled between the Mourne Mountains and the Ring of Gillian. It's known for its blend of traditional charm and vibrant community, with cobbled streets, old stone churches and a bustling town centre. As Christmas approached, Newry streets were glowing with festive lights, and shops were adorned with decorations, bringing warmth to the chill in the air. Carolers filled the streets with familiar songs, and families prepared for gathering with their loved ones to exchange presents. But as dawn broke on Christmas morning 2008, an eerie calm settled over Dublin Road in Newry. Families were gathering, Christmas lunches were being prepared, and children were opening up their presents. But the festivities in the neighbourhood were soon abruptly interrupted by flashing lights and the shrill siren of police cars.
Ambulance service to 39 Dublin Road, Newry. I think she's unconscious. My mother.
Are you with her now?
I'm going upstairs.
Are you going up to where your mother is?
Yes, I haven't seen her yet. Oh my God, she's dead!
Hello? Hello?
Everything, everywhere. I think somebody's broken in.
"81-year-old widow Maire Rankin cherished her independence. Her three-storey terraced home on Lower Dublin Road in Newry was more than just a residence. It was a symbol of her self-reliance and pride. She clung fiercely to her autonomy, with a quiet strength that everybody around her respected. She kept a meticulous home and tended lovingly to her garden, a small but much-loved oasis of life that reflected her own careful nature. Claire, her next-door neighbour, fondly said of her, "Moira was a lovely old lady, a woman who was well liked and respected. She kept a very tidy house and she loved her garden." Moira was modest, a devout churchgoer, and she never touched alcohol. Her life was a simple one, filled with time spent among her family and friends. Yet at 81 years old, Moira was all too aware of the physical frailties that come with age. For years she had battled chest problems, managing her health with a combination of medications and a nebulizer, although she responded well when sickness struck. But as Christmas of 2008 drew close, Moira was struggling with a bad bout of the flu. Her breathing was laboured, her back ached, and the usual holiday spirit felt out of reach. Still, her family was by her side, taking turns in staying overnight. She had 8 children, and they were spread out across the north and south of Ireland, so there was always somebody available. By Christmas Eve, though, Moira's strength seemed to be returning. Her son Diarmuid recollected. Her humour and her spirits were excellent. She said she couldn't wait for Christmas Day. That day was the first that Moira had skipped Christmas Eve Mass in decades. Her daughter, Brenda, tried to encourage her to stay overnight with her and her family in Loch Brickland, where she could be surrounded by her grandchildren. Brenda gently urged her mother to rest and relax, and to let the family take care of her that night. It was Christmas Eve after all. But Moira, true to her nature, wanted to stay in her own home that night. She told her daughter that she had said her prayers and was planning on going to bed to watch Midnight Mass on RTE. She assured her daughter that she would be over first thing on Christmas morning. Christmas morning dawned early in Brenda's home, filled with laughter and excitement as the children unwrapped their presents. Brenda picked up the phone at precisely 9:47 a.m. to wish her mother, Moira, a Merry Christmas and to confirm what time she'd be coming to pick her up. Every year the family gathered together for a Christmas fete, and Brenda knew that her mother wouldn't miss it for the world. But as the phone rang on and on with no answer, Brenda's smile faded. Moira had seemed to improve the night before, but Brenda knew well the toll that age and illness had taken on her mother's health. She felt a mounting sense of unease, so she grabbed her car keys and began to drive through the quiet, decorated streets towards Newry. Meanwhile, Moira's sister was also concerned that she hadn't heard from her. She had called her several times, but each call was met with nothing but silence. She feared that Moira may have fallen and couldn't reach the phone, so her husband, Arthur Morgan, set off to check on her. He pulled up to the familiar home at around 10:20 a.m. The neighbourhood was dressed up for the season, with lights glowing along rooftops and candy cane decorations punctuating the front yards. But Moira's home stood dark. Arthur knocked on the front door, but received no response. He knocked several more times, each one louder than the last, but Moira never came to the front door. He felt a heavy knot of dread and slipped his spare key into the lock and let himself inside the home. The silence and stillness was immediate and unsettling. He called out to Moira, but the silence remained. Drawn by the faint glow of a single lamp, Arthur moved cautiously towards the living room, where the scene grew more ominous. The room was in disarray. There were items scattered on the floor as if in the aftermath of a struggle. In the corner of the room was Moira's Christmas tree, with neatly wrapped presents for the entire family sitting underneath. Arthur slowly climbed the stairs, and on the landing, 2 porcelain ornaments lay smashed on the floor. He pushed open the door to Moira's bedroom. On the floor, she lay motionless, a thick puddle of blood beneath her. She was naked, except for a throw that had been haphazardly placed over her lower body. A large bedroom mirror was overturned beside her. Even more disturbing, the 2-foot crucifix that hung above her bed was lying beside her, smashed. Arthur rushed to Moira's side and knelt down beside her. He slapped her face in an effort to wake her, before trying to open her lips and breathe air into her mouth. But it was immediately clear to Arthur that Moira was dead. Her face and body was cold to the touch, and she was completely stiff. Shaken, he turned and fled from the home, but moments later, Brenda appeared. She entered the home, running upstairs to her mother's bedroom. She was frozen in her tracks when she saw what condition her mother was in. She immediately called 999. When police and paramedics arrived at Maire Rankin's home, it became immediately clear that she was beyond saving. They moved quickly to secure the scene, calling in forensic experts to examine the home, which was now surrounded by a wall of crime scene tape. Moira was known for keeping her home spotless, but inside it was a complete mess, a stark contrast to how friends and family knew that she lived. In the bedroom, signs of a struggle were all too evident. Moira's treasured crucifix lay broken beside her body. Tufts of her hair were scattered on the floor, as though torn out in a desperate struggle. Yet as the experts worked, another troubling detail emerged. Somebody had tried to clean up the scene. It was haphazard, incomplete, but oddly intentional, as if designed to mask the truth. Even more unsettling was the artificial quality to the disorder. The scene felt overly staged, too pointed in its chaos, as if the killer had left misleading clues in an attempt to throw detectives off. When the forensic pathologist arrived on the scene, he carefully examined Moira's body, noting that rigor mortis had set in. He believed that she had died by 9:15 a.m. at the very latest. There was heavy bruising to her forehead and nose, as well as swelling to her scalp, bruising to her right arm, blood in her nose, and what appeared to be injuries to her groin area. Moira's body was soon transported to the mortuary for a detailed autopsy by Professor Crane. His examination revealed extensive bruising to her head, the result of multiple forceful blows. These bruises began at the forehead and extended right across it and down to Moira's eyes. There were fractures to her skull and facial bones, and she had sustained 16 rib fractures, 8 on each side. They looked similar to the type of injuries that are seen during resuscitation, but neither the police, paramedics, nor the family had attempted resuscitation. Further examination uncovered faint bruising and rawness to her right labia, alongside signs of recent bleeding. Professor Crane's examination revealed some chilling details. The injuries to Moira's genital area showed no signs of general inflammation or infection, suggesting they were inflicted post-mortem and likely involved an object, not a person. It looked as though Moira had been sexually assaulted, but only as a way to throw off the investigation. Bruising on her arms and hands pointed to a struggle involving a hard, possibly sharp object. More bruises across her nose and cheek showed that her nebulizer mask had been forcibly pressed or punched against her face. A further injury, small punctures on her chin, aligned with the pointed thorns from the crucifix that was found smashed beside her. It had clearly been used as a weapon. DNA samples were carefully taken from several sites, including her chin, breast, and other areas, in the hopes of uncovering evidence to help solve the case. In the small, close-knit community of Newry, the tragic news spread quickly. The shock was palpable among neighbours who had long known and admired Moira. She had lived in the home for decades, having raised her family there with her husband, who had died years earlier. Claire, her next-door neighbour, voiced the heartbreak felt by many when she said, "To think anyone would sneak into her home and frighten and hurt her is awful. It's left us with a memory of Christmas that no one should ever have." Detective Chief Inspector Gareth Talbot, who was leading the investigation, stated, "This is a particularly dreadful crime, coming as it did on Christmas Day. Investigations are in the early stage, however I would appeal to the public, particularly residents in the neighbourhood, that if they noticed any activity in the area overnight from shortly after 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, to contact us." At Moira's home, forensic teams meticulously combed through the scene. Detectives initially considered whether her murder had been a robbery that had taken a deadly turn. While items were strewn about both upstairs and downstairs, nothing of true value was missing, leading them to quickly rule this out as a motive. With the evident cruelty of the attack, detectives began to consider that Moira had been deliberately targeted. During their search, they found the back door unlocked and slightly ajar, a possible entry point for the intruder. As detectives combed through Maire Rankin's home, another team set out to gather information from her neighbours. One neighbour provided a particularly intriguing detail, recalling that at around 7:25 on Christmas morning, a woman had been sitting on the low wall next to Moira's home. The neighbour described her as having shoulder-length blonde hair, wearing a red top and smoking a cigarette. Although the woman's face wasn't visible, the unusual timing and appearance left a lasting impression. Inside Moira's home, forensic analysis of her phone records raised new questions. Between 7:31 a.m. and 7:37 a.m., someone had used the landline to make 7 calls, all of which were misdialed or wrong numbers. It must have been the killer, detectives surmised, and it was around the same time that the unknown woman was sitting on Moira's wall. Detectives continued in their door-to-door inquiries. They spoke with 42-year-old Karen Walsh, who lived next door to Moira, with her husband, Richard Durkin, a prominent tax consultant from Dublin. Karen, who was a pharmacist, had often helped Moira, including providing her with a heater when her boiler broke down, and notifying other neighbours when Moira accidentally left her door open. Moira had even written a heartfelt note thanking her and her husband for their kindness. That morning, Karen's husband Richard opened up the front door when detectives came by, and he mentioned that Karen had visited Moira late on Christmas Eve. When Karen herself appeared, detectives noticed bruises on her arms. When asked, she attributed them to an incident at a hotel in Dublin and then to carrying Christmas gifts, although her explanation seemed oddly vague. Her physical description, blonde and about the same height as the woman on the wall, also struck detectives as a potential match for the unidentified figure that was seen earlier. Karen described her relationship with Moira warmly, saying they had grown close, even visiting each other's homes a few times that year. On Christmas Eve, Karen had gone over around midnight, bringing Moira a Christmas card and a bottle of vodka.
Christmas Eve, I brought in a Christmas card to her because she always gave us Christmas cards. She thanked me for calling in. She said it's great to have a bit of company.
She claimed she stayed until about 2:30 a.m, explaining that Moira had experienced some breathing issues. Karen said that she left only after Moira assured her that she was feeling better. By Christmas morning, she claimed that her husband had informed her of the police presence next door. Karen admitted that her first thought was one of fear. She said to the detectives, "I thought to myself, sweet divine, what will I do? I was the last person in there. They're probably going to think it was me." Throughout the conversation, however, Karen's questions about Moira's death took detectives by surprise. She asked repeatedly whether Moira had been beaten, a detail that hadn't been released to the public, given that the investigation was only hours old. This curiosity didn't go unnoticed. Detectives quietly noted her apparent fixation on the cause of death. Further inquiries revealed that Karen had contacted another neighbour shortly after the police arrived on Christmas morning. She seemed especially eager to know what had happened, and even asked if the neighbour knew who had last seen Moira alive. Karen's repeated inquiries, paired with her apparent anxiety and visible bruises, painted a concerning picture, giving detectives reason to keep a close eye on her as the investigation unfolded. That afternoon, detectives asked her to come to the station to give a formal statement as a witness, considering she was the last person to see Moira alive.
Can I ask you to state your full name, please?
Karen Walsh.
You're here as a witness and we're conducting a video interview in relation to your knowledge and contact with Mrs. Rankin, okay?
Yeah.
She explained that she had visited Moira on Christmas Eve for a late night drink, arriving sometime between 11:45 p.m. and midnight. According to Karen, Moira had let her in through the intercom and said she had followed Moira's voice to the bedroom, where she found her seated in her rocking chair. They greeted each other with a hug, and Karen claimed she helped Moira use her nebulizer to alleviate her breathing issues. Although Moira's family had noted that her health had been stable, Karen painted a different picture, describing Moira as appearing unwell. Karen said that she drank vodka straight from the bottle, and she had even gone downstairs at one point hoping to find an inhaler, but to no avail. While downstairs, Karen said that she took a mince pie out of her handbag, sat on the sofa and ate it. She recalled considering staying with Moira overnight or inviting her to stay with her family, but ultimately she decided against it. She left some time after 2 a.m, making sure to close the door on her way out.
She was sitting in the armchair. She was seriously wheezy. Because when she was talking, like she was catching her breath big time. That's not Moira. Because she was in such a bad state, I was thinking to myself, what am I going to do? I can't leave her here like this. She says, so we'll be all right, okay? I says, will you just knock on the door next door if you aren't? And I went home to my own house. She shouldn't have been on her own house. I regret that I didn't stay with her or anything.
I appreciate that it's been difficult, but it's obviously important for us to find out, put all the pieces together, Karen, to find out what did happen, Moira.
When detectives questioned her about the neighbour's report of seeing a woman in red sitting on Moira's wall smoking that morning, Karen admitted that she was outside, dressed in red, but firmly denied that she was sitting on the wall or smoking a cigarette. Karen was allowed to return home that afternoon, but on the 27th, she was arrested in relation to Moira's murder. The circumstantial evidence was far too compelling.
I wish to make the following statement in relation to the matters raised in the last number of interviews. I had no involvement whatsoever in the death of Moira. I did not in any way assault Moira. I'm very upset at this moment. This whole thing has been a complete nightmare.
As people across the globe were celebrating the new year, Karen Walsh appeared at Newry Magistrates Court, where she was charged with Moira's murder. Then on the 7th of January, mourners packed St Mary of the Assumption Church to bid Moira one final farewell. The service was presided over by the Auxiliary Bishop of Liverpool, Tom Williams, who was a friend of the family. He said to those in attendance, "She was so proud of her children, grandchildren and community." After the service, children from the local primary school formed a guard of honour as Moira's coffin was carried outside the church. She was then buried in the small graveyard behind it. A bail hearing was held for Walsh on the 13th of February, and during the proceeding, Crown Counsel Philip Henry said that he opposed bail. He said to the court, "Police believe the scene in and around the body had been cleaned. A clean-up operation took place prior to police arrival." He also mentioned how Moira had been sexually assaulted, but said that this was done as a means to throw off the investigation. Defence attorney Philip McGee stressed that Walsh denied any involvement in Moira's murder, before adding, "There's no motive for the applicant to murder Maire Rankin or to harm her. Police do not and have not suggested theft as a motive. The death of Maire Rankin, to some extent, is mysterious." Ultimately, Mr Justice Weatherup approved bail and ordered Walsh to provide an £11,000 cash surety. He also directed her to live at an address in Dublin, surrender her passport, and she was banned from entering Newry other than to report to police. In approving the bail, the judge remarked on Walsh's background, mentioning how she had siblings in medicine. He further said that her background was not the usual scenario for people appearing before court on such a horrific charge. In June, detectives involved in Moira Rankin's murder case returned to court, presenting an urgent request to have Karen Walsh's bail revoked. They testified that a recent tip suggested that Walsh was preparing to flee the country with a fake passport after cosmetic surgery. Her defence attorney dismissed the allegations, explaining that Walsh had been a regular patient at the cosmetic clinic for 12 years, consistently receiving Botox treatments. However, further investigations revealed that her recent visit hadn't been for routine Botox. Instead, Walsh had allegedly inquired about a procedure to radically alter her appearance. Defence attorney Karen Vaughan described Walsh as a broken woman, pointing to her difficult circumstances. He emphasised that she was now unemployed, caring for a young son, and only able to see her husband once a week. Despite the concerns raised by detectives, the judge ultimately allowed Walsh to remain on bail, although he ordered her to move from Dublin to Belfast. Meanwhile, forensic analysis results began to unravel a chilling web of evidence. DNA found on the broken crucifix, which lay near Moira's body, matched both Moira and Walsh. The crucifix had even left an imprint of the crown of thorns on Moira's chin. Additionally, Walsh's DNA was found on Moira's breasts, inner thighs and arms, further implicating her in the assault. An almost empty bottle of vodka in Moira's home also bore a mixed DNA profile, with Walsh as the main contributor. By May the following year, Karen Walsh was ordered to stand trial for Moira's murder. Appearing in Newry Crown Court, she pleaded not guilty, setting the stage for the upcoming legal battle. The murder trial began at Belfast Crown Court on the morning of the 20th of September 2011. Karen Walsh was escorted into the courtroom and sat alongside her defence team as the public gallery slowly filled up. During the opening statements, prosecutor Liam McCollum said to the jury that there was compelling evidence to show that Walsh was the killer. He said that there was DNA evidence against Walsh, but that wasn't all. Moira's killer had used her home phone to call a series of incorrect phone numbers on Christmas morning. However, these phone numbers were all similar to Walsh's husband's phone number. The prosecution believed that after killing Moira, Walsh had tried to phone her husband, but was in such a frantic panic that she mixed up the dialing codes for the north and the south. As for the motivation, it wasn't completely known. However, the prosecution believed that Walsh and her husband had gotten into an argument. This motivation had been suggested by an inmate that was locked up with Karen Walsh. She told detectives that Walsh had admitted to the murder.
I could almost see this house, the way she described it. It's like a row of houses. Seemed like it was an older house, 2 or 3 stories. And it was about 1 or 2 in the morning, Christmas Eve night, Christmas morning, and that she had been drinking. And she just said she'd had an argument with her husband. Another argument with her husband. She had gone over because she was upset and she wanted to continue drinking. And the older lady, she started lecturing her. You know, all this drinking and everything else, telling me that I was ruining my life. I had a beautiful wee boy. But being so drunk that she just didn't want to listen. The way she said it to me, it was like the lady had taken hold of her and said, "Look, listen to me." And she said she pushed her away. And lady lost her balance and hit her head.
Apparently Moira didn't like the fact that Walsh was drinking vodka neat and getting drunker and drunker by the minute. It was the prosecution's theory that Walsh had left her home that night with a litre bottle of vodka and decided to call into Moira's home to drink it. But Moira, who was a devout Christian, maybe expressed that she wasn't welcome. She didn't tolerate drunks in her home. They believed that Walsh flew into a drunken rage and killed her elderly neighbour, and then staged the scene to make it look as though the male was a killer. The jury got to hear testimony from Arthur Morgan and Moira's daughter, Brenda. They emotionally detailed how they had found her body on Christmas morning. Through tears, Brenda spoke about their last phone call on Christmas Eve and how she tried to persuade her mother to stay over. She recalled, "I wish I had have persuaded her. It was the only time in her life that she spent Christmas Eve on her own." She testified about breaking the news of her mother's murder to her brother when he arrived at the family home on Christmas morning from his home in Omeath. She testified, "I said I think someone has killed Mummy." Karen Walsh had maintained that she had gone to Moira's home on Christmas Eve to drink vodka together. However, one of Moira's daughters, Marie, had testified that her mother never drank spirits. She recollected, "She would have been horrified if we got drunk in the house. That was a taboo." Testimony was then presented by senior forensic scientist Lauren Marshall. He spoke about the crucifix. The pathologist, Professor Crane, testified about Moira's injuries. He said that the injuries to her genitals had been caused by some kind of interference. However, he said he ruled out the possibility of sexual intercourse. As for the head injuries, he believed that she had sustained repeated blows, either by punching or with a blunt object. He said that while Moira's bones were more brittle than a younger person, a degree of force had been used. During cross-examination by defence attorney Irvine, it was suggested that the facial bruising could have been caused by Moira falling while wearing her nebulizer mask. However, Professor Crane didn't believe that this was possible. Instead, he said that Moira had been assaulted by somebody who was holding the mask. The DNA evidence against Karen Walsh was presented the following week. Forensic biologist Susan Woodruff said that Walsh's DNA was found on Moira's chin. She said that the possibility of someone other than Walsh depositing it there was less than 1 in 1 billion. However, she couldn't give a similar statistical analysis for the samples from Moira's breasts or the crucifix because not enough DNA had been obtained. She continued and said that of a possible 11 components from Walsh, there was 9 on the left breast and 10 each on the right breast and the crucifix. She said this meant that the DNA profile could have come from Walsh, but she couldn't say for sure. Under cross-examination by defence attorney Irvine, she agreed that direct transfer was the most likely method of how Walsh's DNA got on Moira's chin. She further agreed that it could have been through a kiss. After the experts stepped down, the defence began their case by calling Karen Walsh to the witness stand. She told the jury that when she left Moira's home in the early morning hours of Christmas Day, her breathing was wheezy but she was fine. Her defence attorney asked if at any stage while visiting Moira did she assault her, sexually interfere with her, pull her hair, argue with her or attack her. Walsh responded, "No, I did not. I could not have been any nicer to Miss Rankin. She was the nicest person you could meet." Walsh described going into Moira's home and finding her upstairs in the rocking chair. She said she debated bringing Moira to her home that night. She told the courtroom, "I was worried that if I wasn't there, she would not be able to do it on her own in case she needed to go to the toilet or anything." According to Walsh, Moira thought about it for a minute but then told her no, that her family were coming over early the next morning. Walsh was asked whether she had made any phone calls on Christmas morning from Moira's home, and she denied that she had. When she was cross-examined by prosecutor McCollum, she was asked why she asked detectives whether Moira had been beaten. He asked, "You could only think beaten if you knew she had been beaten, and you thought beaten as you had beaten her. Isn't that the truth?" He further questioned whether it was normal for her to call on an elderly neighbour that late. He had his own theory for why Walsh showed up with a bottle of vodka. He said to Walsh, "The truth is, it was for you, but you wanted to take it away from your husband because he maybe didn't approve of you drinking vodka neat." It was their belief that Karen Walsh was an alcoholic and had killed Moira in a drunken rage and then ransacked her home and sexually assaulted her to make it look as though a man was responsible. That night, before Walsh went into Moira's home, she had actually gone to another neighbour's home to continue drinking after an argument with her husband. The prosecutor said of Moira, "She would have said to you, 'You're ruining your life. You have a beautiful son next door and a husband. What are you doing here in the middle of the night on Christmas night? You didn't want this lady telling you how to live your life. You grabbed the crucifix and started hitting her on the head. You were drunk, and then realising what happened, you panicked because you thumped her, beat her with the cross, and there she is lying on the floor, and you realise too late that she's been killed. Then you started throwing things around the room to make it look as though it was ransacked, and carried out the sexual assault to make it look as though there was some male who did it." Karen Walsh denied that this was the truth, but the prosecutor wasn't finished yet. He suggested that Walsh then removed Moira's clothing, and that's why her DNA was on her breasts. Walsh responded, "No, I hugged and kissed her." After Walsh stepped down, the defence called on Professor Dan Crane, who gave evidence via video link from Ohio University. He spoke about the forensic evidence in the case, telling the jury that it was a matter of significant concern, that it couldn't conclusively be said that Walsh's DNA was found on Moira's body other than on her chin. He stated, "I'm not comfortable in saying that Miss Walsh can't be excluded without also saying what fraction of the population would be similarly included." After that, the trial drew to a close. During the closing arguments, prosecutor Liam McCollum said that all evidence pointed towards Walsh being guilty of Moira's murder. He said either that, or she was the unluckiest person in the world, because so much incriminating evidence pointed towards her being the killer. While some of the DNA evidence was somewhat open-ended, he said that Walsh's DNA was found on her chin, breasts, and a crucifix that had been used to beat her. There was also evidence somebody inside the home had tried to call Walsh his husband on Christmas morning. He argued that if Walsh's account was to be believed, that meant that somebody else crept into Moira's home after Walsh left, killed her, and left behind no evidence. He stated, "It's not hard to come to the conclusion that there's only one plausible explanation for the events you have heard unfold before you in this courtroom, and that is that Karen Walsh did in fact murder Miss Rankin." During his closing arguments, defence attorney Peter Irvine told the jury that they had to decide the case not on any sympathy they had for Moira, but instead the evidence that they had heard. He said that it was a circumstantial case, but said that evidence pointed towards Walsh's guilt. The defence said that when you examine the strands of evidence, the only conclusion was that Walsh was not guilty. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before they reached a verdict. They found Karen Walsh guilty of the murder of Maire Rankin. Mr. Justice Hart then told Walsh that the law permits the only sentence for murder was that of life in prison. As she shook her head in disbelief, he said, "Whatever happened on that night, this was a brutal attack on an elderly and defenceless woman." Moira's family were in attendance, and her eldest daughter said to the courtroom through tears, "Mummy suffered horrific death and sexual assault in her bedroom. She was savagely and persistently beaten with a crucifix. Clumps of her hair were violently pulled out by the roots. She was left with head injuries and broken ribs before being subjected to the ultimate defilement of her body." She was speaking on behalf of the entire family and said that the murder trial had been a harrowing experience, but thanked the police and the prosecution for their hard work. She described her mother as a kind and caring woman who had spent her entire life helping people. Through tears, she said, "She never hurt anybody. She had the right to feel secure in her own home, but because of her trusting nature and kindness, she was subjected to a horrific murder. She died alone and frightened. She was deprived of a dignified death in the company of her family." Detective Inspector John Caldwell also had some comments. He said that Moira's family still hadn't been told why she was killed. He stated, "They have lost Moira's love and company because of the drunken, depraved actions of someone she trusted as a neighbour." Mr. Justice Hart then adjourned passing sentence until pre-sentence probation reports and victim impact statements were lodged. As Walsh was led from the courtroom to the cells, she turned and said, "I'm completely innocent." Karen Walsh returned to court on the 28th of October. She was dressed in a dark trouser suit with her blonde hair swept back into a ponytail. She was addressed by Mr. Justice Hart. He said he didn't believe that she intended to kill Moira, and even suggested the injuries to her ribs had come from her trying to resuscitate her. Afterwards, however, Walsh tried to cover up the scene in the most horrific way possible, by sexually assaulting Moira, possibly with the crucifix that she used to beat her. The judge then sentenced Walsh to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years before she could be considered for parole. From court, Walsh was sent to Hydebank Women's Prison in South Belfast, which houses some of Northern Ireland's most notorious female inmates. For Moira's family, it was a long-awaited step towards justice. Her eldest daughter, Emily, spoke to the media. She said that in a sense, the entire family felt as though they had lost Christmas. However, with Karen Walsh where she belonged, they could finally start to rebuild their lives. Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to say a massive thank you to my newest supporter up on Patreon, David. You can join us up on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and there are absolutely no obligations. You can cancel your subscription at any point. I'd also like to say a massive happy holidays to everybody, and a huge thank you to everyone who subscribed to Morbidology this year, recommended it to a friend, left a rating or review, or simply listened to a single episode. I genuinely do appreciate each and every one of you, and hope that you all have a fantastic festive period, whatever you may be doing. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read some true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.